My name is Sarah. I'm 27 years old. And that was the moment I learned what it feels like when home spits you out. The words hit me like a freight train carrying 27 years of lies. You have 48 hours to get your stuff out. That house belongs to your sister now. My mother's voice cut through the kitchen air like broken glass, each syllable designed to slice whatever was left of my heart into pieces too small to ever put back together. 48 hours. 2 days to erase a lifetime. 2 days to pack up memories, dreams, and the naive belief that blood meant something more than the fluid running through selfish veins. I stood there in the doorway, my coffee mug trembling in my hands, watching my mother's face twist into something I didn't recognize. Or maybe I was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. The betrayal didn't come with warning bells or flashing lights. It came with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather, delivered over breakfast like any other mundane family announcement. Pass the salt, dear. Oh, and Sarah, you're homeless now. That's the thing about betrayal. It arrives wearing the mask of ordinary Tuesday mornings, disguised as routine conversation between people who once claimed to love you. Before we continue down this rabbit hole of family destruction, I need something from you. Drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in the UK, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in Australia, I want to know. Don't just sit back like a silent observer of someone else's pain. Tell me where in the world you are, because misery might love company, but revenge loves witnesses. Now, let's dive into the story that taught me the difference between family and blood relatives. The silence that followed my mother's declaration was deafening. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with morning meditation or gentle snowfall. This was the oppressive silence of a tomb, thick with the weight of words that couldn't be taken back and bridges burning faster than anyone could cross them. My sister sat at the kitchen table, fork suspended halfway to her mouth, eyes darting between our mother and me like she was watching a tennis match where souls were the stakes. What did you just say? The words crawled out of my throat, raw and disbelieving. Surely I'd misheard. Surely this was some twisted joke, the kind of dark humor our family specialized in but never quite mastered. You heard me perfectly well. My mother's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. Rebecca needs this house for her growing family. You're single, you have no responsibilities. You'll figure it out. Rebecca. My younger sister by 3 years, the golden child who could do no wrong, who'd married her college sweetheart and produced 2 perfect grandchildren for my parents to dote over. Rebecca, who sat there like a statue, saying nothing, doing nothing, becoming complicit through her cowardice. I set my coffee mug down with deliberate care, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter what little self-control I had left. The kitchen around me, the same kitchen where I'd helped my mother bake birthday cakes, where I'd done homework at the scarred wooden table, where I'd shared countless meals, and even more conversations, suddenly felt foreign. The yellow walls that once felt warm now seemed jaundiced with sickness. The family photos hanging on the refrigerator mocked me with their false promises of unconditional love. This is my home too, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I've lived here my entire life. I help with the mortgage, I pay for groceries, You're 27 years old, my mother interrupted, her words sharp enough to draw blood. Most people your age have their own place. We've been more than generous letting you stay this long. Letting me stay. As if I were some charity case they'd taken pity on rather than their daughter. As if the money I contributed each month was pocket change rather than a significant portion of my teacher's salary. As if my presence in their lives was a burden they'd finally decided to shed. The room began to spin slightly, the way it does when you realize you're standing on quicksand disguised as solid ground. Every assumption I'd made about my place in this family, every belief I'd held about love and loyalty and home, crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. I looked at my sister one more time, hoping to find an ally, a voice of reason, someone who might speak up for justice or at least basic human decency. But Rebecca kept her eyes fixed on her breakfast, a coward hiding behind scrambled eggs and toast. The sister who'd shared my bedroom for 15 years, who'd cried on my shoulder through her first heartbreak, who'd asked me to be maid of honor at her wedding, that sister had vanished, replaced by a stranger who lacked the courage to even meet my eyes. 48 hours, I repeated, tasting the bitter flavor of disbelief. You're giving me 48 hours. That should be plenty of time to pack your things, my mother said, already turning away, already dismissing me like I was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her day. And that's when I knew. This wasn't about Rebecca needing the house. This wasn't about my age or my supposed lack of responsibility. This was about power. This was about showing me exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy, which apparently was somewhere below the family dog. At least Max got to keep his bed. I walked upstairs to my room, each step feeling like a funeral march. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, lined with family photos that now felt like evidence of an elaborate lie. There I was at Christmas morning, age 7, grinning toothlessly while tearing open presents. There I was at my high school graduation, proud and hopeful, surrounded by people I thought would always have my back. There I was at Rebecca's wedding, smiling like a fool while standing next to people who were already planning my exile. My bedroom door creaked as I pushed it open, the same creak it had made for 20 years, the same creak my parents had promised to fix, but never quite got around to. The room looked exactly as I'd left it that morning: unmade bed, clothes draped over the chair, textbooks scattered across my desk from the lesson plans I'd been working on the night before. Everything normal, everything unchanged, except for the invisible eviction notice now hanging in the air like smog. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to process what had just happened. Tried to understand how a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning had transformed into the day my family decided I was disposable. Tried to figure out when I'd stopped being their daughter and become their tenant, and apparently a tenant they no longer wanted. The walls of my childhood bedroom seemed to close in around me, decorated with posters and memories from a girl who'd believed in fairy tale endings and families that stuck together through thick and thin. That girl felt like a stranger now, a naive child who'd never learned that home was a privilege that could be revoked without warning. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone who might offer temporary shelter while I figured out my next move. The list felt pathetically short. Most of my friends had moved away after college, started their own lives in other cities with better opportunities. The few who remained were either living with roommates in cramped apartments or back home with their own families. Finally, I found Jessica's number. We'd been close in high school but had drifted apart over the years, staying in touch through occasional social media likes and birthday messages. I stared at her contact information for several minutes before finding the courage to call. Sarah? Oh my God, it's been forever. How are you? How was I? Homeless. Betrayed. Discovering that 27 years of family love had been nothing more than an elaborate performance. I'm okay, I lied, my voice cracking slightly. Listen, this is going to sound weird, but I need a place to stay for a few days. Just temporarily while I find an apartment. The pause on the other end felt like an eternity. Of course. What happened? Are you okay? Family stuff, I said, unable to elaborate without completely falling apart. I'll explain later. I need somewhere to go. You can take the couch. It's not much, but you're welcome to stay as long as you need. The relief in my chest was immediately followed by a crushing wave of shame. This was my life now. Begging for couch space from people I barely spoke to anymore, all because the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had decided I was inconvenient. I spent the next 2 hours packing my belongings with mechanical precision, each item feeling heavier than it should. My diplomas, my books, my clothes, my photographs, everything that made up the physical evidence of my existence stuffed into boxes and suitcases like artifacts from a life that had ended without warning. The house around me buzzed with normal activity. I could hear my mother on the phone downstairs, probably calling Rebecca to discuss logistics for the big move. I could hear the television in the living room, playing some mindless morning talk show about celebrity gossip and cooking tips. Life continued as if nothing had changed, as if one of the family members hadn't just been expelled from paradise. Nobody came to check on me. Nobody offered to help pack. Nobody even acknowledged the sounds of my life being dismantled in the room above their heads. The silence was louder than any argument could have been, more painful than any shouting match. It was the silence of people who had already moved on, who had already decided I was no longer their problem. When I finally loaded the last box into my car, my hands were raw from cardboard cuts and my back ached from lifting. I stood in the driveway for a moment, looking back at the house that had shaped me into the person I was. The blue shutters my father had painted 3 summers ago. The rose bushes my mother tended with such care. The tree I'd climbed as a child, the one with my initials carved into its bark. Everything looked exactly the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. I drove to Jessica's apartment in a haze of disbelief, my rearview mirror full of boxes and my head full of questions that had no good answers. The radio played cheerful pop songs that felt obscene in their happiness, so I drove in silence, letting the weight of my new reality settle into my bones. Jessica's apartment was a modest 1-bedroom in a complex that had seen better days. The walls were thin, the carpet was stained, and the couch I'd be sleeping on sagged in the middle like a defeated smile. But it was shelter, and shelter was more than my own family had offered me. I made up the couch with clean sheets, Jessica said, trying to sound upbeat despite the obvious awkwardness of the situation. There's coffee in the kitchen, and you can use whatever you need in the bathroom. I thanked her with what little grace I had left, then sat on the edge of the couch that would be my bed for the foreseeable future. The apartment smelled like cleaning products and microwave dinners, a sharp contrast to the familiar sense of my childhood home. The refrigerator hummed constantly, a mechanical lullaby that would keep me awake through the long nights ahead. That first night was the longest of my life. I lay on Jessica's couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to sounds that weren't mine in a space that would never be home. The borrowed blanket smelled like fabric softener and stale food, carrying the subtle reminder that I was now dependent on the charity of others. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice, "You have 48 hours." Every time I tried to find a comfortable position on the lumpy cushions, I remembered my own bed, my own room, my own space that was no longer mine. The shame pressed against my chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, harder to think, impossible to sleep. How had I become disposable in my own family? When had I stopped being a daughter and become an inconvenience? These questions circled through my mind like vultures, picking at the carcass of my self-worth until nothing remained but doubt and pain. If you've ever felt like the people you love turned their backs on you, hit subscribe. And if you refuse to subscribe, at least comment why. You might find out you're not the only one carrying that pain. Because pain shared is the only kind that becomes bearable, and silence is just another word for surrender. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of humiliation and desperate apartment hunting. I'd wake up on Jessica's couch feeling displaced and grateful in equal measure, then spend my days scrolling through rental listings that might as well have been written in a foreign language. First month, last month, and security deposit required. Credit check and references necessary. No pets, no smoking, no recent evictions from family homes due to being unwanted. Okay, that last one wasn't actually in the listings, but it might as well have been. Every application felt like a confession of failure. Every "will be in touch" felt like another door closing in my face. The rental market was brutal for someone with a teacher's salary, and even more brutal for someone whose entire sense of stability had been shattered in a single breakfast conversation. I'd return to Jessica's apartment each evening exhausted and defeated, trying to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible. I'd eat dinner from takeout containers while Jessica watched television, both of us pretending this arrangement was temporary and normal rather than the result of familial catastrophe. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort of sleeping on a couch or the logistical nightmare of finding affordable housing. The worst part was the looks. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes burning into me, accompanied by whispered conversations that stopped the moment I approached. Did you hear? Her own mom kicked her out. I heard it was over money. I heard she was stealing from them. 27 years old and homeless. That's what happens when you don't plan ahead. The rumors spread through our small town like wildfire in a drought, each retelling more vicious than the last. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that people had a juicy story to dissect over their morning coffee. My pain had become their entertainment, my humiliation their gossip fodder. I ran into our neighbor Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store on day 5 of my exile. She'd known me since I was a toddler, had watched me grow up from her kitchen window that overlooked our backyard. I'd mowed her lawn and shoveled her driveway countless times over the years, had listened to stories about her late husband and admired photos of her grandchildren. "Sarah, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I heard about your situation. Such a shame when families can't work things out." The way she said situation made it sound like I'd contracted some contagious disease rather than been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love me most. Her eyes held that particular gleam that some people get when they encounter someone else's misfortune, the look of someone grateful it wasn't happening to them. Yes, well, I managed, trying to maintain some dignity while standing in the cereal aisle with my small basket of generic brands and marked-down produce. These things happen. "Oh, I'm sure you'll land on your feet," she said, patting my arm with the kind of condescending touch usually reserved for small children and wounded animals. Young people are so resilient these days. Resilient. As if resilience was something I'd chosen rather than something that had been forced upon me. As if bouncing back from betrayal was a life skill they taught in school alongside algebra and biology. I finished my shopping as quickly as possible and drove back to Jessica's apartment, my hands shaking with rage and embarrassment. The grocery bags felt heavier than they should have, weighed down by the burden of starting over with nothing and no one. That night, lying on the couch that had become my temporary prison, I stared at my phone and scrolled through social media. My mother had posted a photo of herself and Rebecca looking at paint samples with the caption, "So excited to help my daughter make this house a home." The comments were full of hearts and congratulations, as if my displacement was cause for celebration. Rebecca had posted a photo of her children playing in what used to be my backyard, with the caption, "Home Sweet Home." Her friends had responded with enthusiasm about playdates and family barbecues, completely oblivious to the fact that this happiness was built on my exile. I wanted to comment. I wanted to tell the truth about what had really happened, wanted to shatter their perfect narrative with the reality of their cruelty. But something held me back, maybe pride, maybe exhaustion, maybe the growing realization that defending yourself to people who've already decided you're guilty is a fool's errand. Instead, I closed the app and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical lullaby, the neighbors argued through thin walls, and my mind raced with questions that had no answers. How do you rebuild a life when the foundation was built on lies? How do you trust anyone again when the people who created you decided you were disposable? The answer came on day 7, in the form of a phone call that would change everything. I was sitting on Jessica's couch, laptop balanced on my knees, typing up lesson plans for the substitute teacher who was covering my classes. I'd had to take a week off work to deal with my housing situation, using precious sick days for a crisis that had nothing to do with actual illness and everything to do with the terminal condition of my family relationships. The phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. My experience with unknown numbers had been limited to telemarketers and debt collectors lately. But something made me answer. "Sarah Martinez?" "Yes. My name is David Coleman. I'm an attorney with Coleman, Walsh and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of your grandfather, Thomas Martinez." I nearly dropped the phone. My grandfather had died when I was 12, 15 years ago. His estate had been settled long ago, or so I'd always been told. What could an attorney possibly want with me about something that had been resolved when I was still in middle school? "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather's estate was handled years ago." "I understand your confusion, Miss Martinez. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning at 10? There are some documents you need to see." The tone of his voice suggested this wasn't a request, but a necessity, the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked an underlying urgency. I agreed to the meeting, scribbled down the address, and spent the rest of the night lying awake wondering what fresh hell was about to unfold. David Coleman's office was located in a building that had seen better days, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and legal documents, decorated with degrees and certificates that proclaimed his competence in matters of law and human misery. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time buried in paperwork than worrying about his appearance. "Miss Martinez, thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, which was covered with neat stacks of files and legal documents. "What I'm about to tell you may come as a shock." I laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I've been living on my friend's couch for a week because my own mother decided I was homeless. I'm not sure anything can shock me anymore." He smiled sympathetically, then opened a thick file folder. "Your grandfather left a will. A very specific will that your parents were named as executors of, with instructions that certain information not be shared with you until you reach the age of 25. 25. I'd turned 25 2 years ago. 2 years of living in my parents' house, contributing to their mortgage, believing I was dependent on their generosity, while they sat on information that could have changed everything." "What kind of information?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be devastating. He pulled out a document, official and intimidating, covered with legal language and official seals. "Your grandfather owned significant property, Miss Martinez, including the house you grew up in." The room tilted slightly, the way it does when you realize you've been walking on quicksand disguised as solid ground for your entire adult life. "What do you mean he owned it?" "Your parents have been living in a house that legally belongs to you and your sister in equal shares. They were supposed to inform you of this inheritance when you turned 25. They were also supposed to transfer the property into your names at that time." The words hit me like a physical blow. For 2 years, I'd been paying rent to live in a house that was already mine. For 2 years, my parents had accepted my money while sitting on the knowledge that they were essentially stealing from me. For 2 years, they'd held power over me that was never rightfully theirs. "They never said anything," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They never mentioned a will, an inheritance, anything. According to this documentation, they were legally required to inform you no later than your 25th birthday. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of lies. 2 years of accepting their generosity while they pocketed money for a house they didn't own. 2 years of believing I was dependent on them while they were actually dependent on my ignorance." "What does this mean?" I asked, though my heart was already pounding with the implications. "It means, Miss Martinez, that you have significant legal recourse. It means that the house they just kicked you out of belongs to you as much as it belongs to your sister. It means they've been in violation of your grandfather's will for 2 years, and depending on how we proceed, they could be facing serious legal consequences." The power dynamic that had governed my entire life shifted in that moment, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves beneath the surface of the earth. For 27 years, I'd accepted my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. For 27 years, I'd believed that home was something granted to me by others rather than something I owned outright. Suddenly, I wasn't the powerless daughter begging for shelter. I was a property owner who'd been illegally evicted from her own home. "What would you like to do?" Mr. Coleman asked, his voice gentle but professional. I stared at the documents spread across his desk, official proof that everything I'd believed about my life was built on lies. My parents hadn't been generous landlords, they'd been thieves. My sister wasn't inheriting the family home, she was participating in fraud. My homelessness wasn't the result of family disappointment, it was the result of criminal behavior. I need to think, I said, my voice steadier than I'd felt in days. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Miss Martinez. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. Don't let them know you have this information until you've decided how you want to proceed. People who've been dishonest for this long are capable of making the situation much worse if they feel cornered. I nodded, gathered the copies of documents he'd prepared for me, and walked out of his office in a daze. The world looked different through the lens of truth. The building where I'd just learned I was a property owner rather than a charity case. The street where I'd grown up believing I was lucky to have a family home when I'd actually inherited one. The car I was driving to my friend's apartment instead of my own house, which was legally mine. This is where everything changes. If you were in my shoes, what would you do first? Comment below before you hear what I did, because the choice I made would determine whether justice tasted sweet or bitter. I drove back to Jessica's apartment in complete silence, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd just learned. The documents sat on the passenger seat beside me like evidence of a crime I was only beginning to understand. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts from my parents, desperate attempts at communication that I now understood had nothing to do with love and everything to do with covering their tracks. Sarah, we need to talk. Please call us back. We can work this out. Don't be stubborn about this. Each message was more desperate than the last, and I began to understand why. They knew. They had to know that eventually, the truth would surface. They'd been living on borrowed time, hoping I'd remain ignorant and compliant forever, hoping their lies would never catch up with them. But I didn't respond. Not to the calls, not to the texts, not to the voicemails that grew increasingly frantic as the hours passed. I watched their desperation grow from the safety of Jessica's couch, and for the first time in my life, I held the power in our relationship. My sister joined the chorus of desperate communication on day 2 of my silence. Her messages were different from our parents', longer, more emotional, clearly calculated to appeal to whatever sisterly bond she hoped still existed between us. Sarah, please. I know you're upset, but we're family. We can figure this out together. Mom and Dad just want what's best for everyone. Please call me back. What's best for everyone? As if evicting me from my own home was some kind of family intervention, as if their theft was motivated by love rather than greed. I screenshotted every message, saved every voicemail, documented their panic with the cold precision of someone building a legal case. Because that's exactly what I was doing. On day 3 of my silence, I met with a friend from college who'd gone to law school. Marcus Chin had been in my study group for economics, a brilliant guy who'd always been able to see through complicated problems to find simple solutions. Don't fight with words, he said after reviewing my documents. Don't give them the satisfaction of an emotional confrontation. Fight with silence and paper. Let the law speak for you. His office was small but professional, filled with law books and certificates that proclaimed his expertise in matters exactly like mine. He spread my grandfather's will across his desk like a map of victory, pointing out clauses and legal language that painted my parents as criminals and me as their victim. This is fraud, he said simply. They've been defrauding you for 2 years. The fact that they're now trying to permanently remove you from property you legally own makes it even worse. What are my options? You could sue them for theft, fraud, and illegal eviction. You could force the sale of the property and take your 50% in cash. You could demand they buy out your share at market value. Or, he paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You could move back into your own house and make them leave. The last option sent a thrill through me that was part justice and part revenge. The thought of walking back into the house they'd kicked me out of, not as a grateful daughter, but as a property owner enforcing her legal rights, was intoxicating. What would you recommend? Honestly? Start with a demand letter. Give them 30 days to remedy the situation by either buying out your share or returning your rightful access to the property. If they don't comply, we escalate. Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough to make people see reason. But I wasn't interested in reason. I was interested in justice. And justice, I was learning, often looked different than reason. Send the letter, I said. But I want to deliver it personally. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? That could get emotional very quickly. They made this emotional when they decided to steal from me for 2 years. I'm just making it legal. Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon. For days, I'd been wielding that weapon with surgical precision, watching my family's panic grow as their calls went unanswered and their texts disappeared into the void of my indifference. But silence was just the beginning. Now it was time to speak, and when I spoke, it would be with the voice of law and justice rather than hurt feelings and family drama. Would you have stayed silent or confronted them? Subscribe if silence would have been your weapon too, because patience is the predator that waits for the perfect moment to strike. The demand letter was a thing of beauty, 3 pages of legal language that laid out exactly what my parents had done and exactly what they needed to do to avoid prosecution. Marcus had crafted it with the precision of a surgeon and the brutality of a warrior, each paragraph building toward an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. Failure to comply with these demands within 30 days will result in immediate legal action, including, but not limited to, criminal charges for fraud, theft, and illegal eviction. I read those words over and over, savoring the power they contained. For 27 years, my parents had held all the cards in our relationship. Now, finally, I had the winning hand. But before I delivered justice, they delivered one final insult. The invitation came in the mail, formal and ridiculous. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez request the pleasure of your company for a family dinner on Saturday evening at 6 o'clock. I stared at the ivory cardstock, amazed by their audacity. They'd kicked me out of the house, stolen my inheritance, and ignored my existence for over a week. Now they wanted to have dinner like none of it had happened, like we were a normal family gathering for a normal meal. But I knew it wasn't about family bonding. This was a trap, a final attempt to manipulate me into compliance before their lies unraveled completely. They probably planned to offer me some token amount of money, maybe help with a security deposit on an apartment, anything to keep me quiet and grateful for their scraps. I almost didn't go. Almost mailed the demand letter instead and let the lawyers handle everything from a safe distance. But something about that invitation, something about their assumption that I would still come when called like an obedient dog, made me want to face them one more time. So I went shopping. I'd been living in jeans and t-shirts for a week, dressing like someone who'd given up on life, because that's exactly what I'd been. But for this dinner, this final confrontation, I wanted to look like someone who'd taken control of her destiny. I bought a black dress with clean lines and sharp angles, the kind of outfit that meant business. I bought heels that made me 3 inches taller and infinitely more confident. I bought a blazer that transformed me from victim to victor. When I looked in the dressing room mirror, I didn't see the broken girl who'd been sleeping on her friend's couch. I saw a woman who owned half a house and all of her own power. Saturday evening arrived gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I drove to the house, my house, with the demand letter in my purse and steel in my spine. The driveway looked the same, the front yard looked the same, but I was different. I wasn't coming home as their daughter. I was arriving as their reckoning. The front door opened before I could knock, my mother appearing with a smile so fake it could have been manufactured in a factory that specialized in artificial emotion. "Sarah, you look lovely, dear. Come in, come in." The house smelled like roast beef and desperation. The dining room table was set with the good china, the kind they'd only used for special occasions when I was growing up. White tablecloth, silver candlesticks, flowers from the garden arranged in my grandmother's crystal vase. They'd pulled out all the stops for this performance, created a stage set designed to evoke memories of better times and family unity. My father stood awkwardly by the window, his hands in his pockets, his expression somewhere between guilty and defiant. Rebecca sat at the table looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, her husband conspicuously absent, her children nowhere to be seen. "Where are Tom and the kids?" I asked, taking my seat at the table like I was accepting a throne. "Tom's working late," Rebecca said quickly. "And the kids are at my mother-in-law's." Translation: her husband wanted no part of this family drama, and they didn't want their children to witness whatever was about to unfold. Smart man. Smarter children. We ate in tense silence for the first few minutes, the sound of silverware against china the only conversation in the room. I watched my parents exchange glances, each waiting for the other to begin whatever speech they'd rehearsed for this occasion. Finally, my mother cleared her throat. "Sarah, we've been thinking about everything that happened last week, and we realize we may have been a bit hasty." Hasty. As if illegally evicting me from my own home was the same as forgetting to water the plants. "We didn't mean for things to get so heated," my father added, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd practiced this apology in the mirror. "You know we love you. You know family means everything to us." Love. Family. These words felt obscene coming from people who'd been stealing from me for 2 years. "We've talked to Rebecca," my mother continued, "and we think we can work something out. Maybe you could stay in the guest room for a while, just until you get back on your feet." The guest room. In my own house. They were offering me charity in my own home, generous landlords granting temporary shelter to their homeless daughter. I set down my fork with deliberate precision and looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA, but not my values. "Love doesn't evict you with 48 hours on the clock," I said, my voice calm and clear. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. My mother's smile faltered, my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Rebecca finally looked up from her plate. "Now, Sarah," my mother began, but I cut her off. "You called me disposable," I continued, each word chosen for maximum impact. "Now you're begging me to stay." "We never called you disposable," my father protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You didn't have to use the word. Actions speak louder than vocabulary." I stood up, pulling the demand letter from my purse with theatrical precision. Family doesn't come with eviction notices, but legal documents do. I placed the letter on the table between us like a bomb with a lit fuse. "That's from my attorney. It explains exactly what my grandfather left me in his will, exactly what you've been hiding from me for 2 years, and exactly what you need to do to avoid criminal charges for fraud and theft." The silence that followed was beautiful, the kind of quiet that comes when truth finally speaks after years of being gagged by lies. I watched the color drain from my parents' faces as they realized their game was over, their secrets exposed, their power gone. "You can't be serious," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dead serious. As serious as eviction notices and 48-hour ultimatums." I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. "You have 30 days to comply with the terms in that letter. After that, we let the courts decide what happens to people who steal from their own children." I paused at the dining room doorway, looking back at the wreckage of what had once been my family. "Oh, and just so we're clear this time, I'm leaving by choice. There's a difference." The front door closed behind me with a satisfying click, the sound of a chapter ending and justice beginning. I walked to my car with my head high and my conscience clear, no longer the victim of their manipulation, but the architect of their consequences. If this was you, would you forgive them or walk away forever? Comment below, because silence won't save them this time. The truth was out, the documents were filed, and the reckoning they'd avoided for 2 years was finally at hand. The aftermath of that dinner was swift and brutal, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Within hours of my dramatic exit, my phone exploded with calls and texts from family members, friends, and neighbors who'd somehow heard about the legal bombshell I'd dropped in the middle of their roast beef dinner. My mother called 17 times in the first hour alone, her voicemails progressing from angry to desperate to borderline hysterical. "You can't do this to your family," evolved into, "Please, we can work this out," which eventually became, "How could you be so cruel?" Cruel. The woman who'd stolen my inheritance and illegally evicted me from my own home was calling me cruel for demanding justice. My father's messages were shorter, but equally revealing. "This will destroy our reputation in this town." Not "we're sorry for what we did" or "we want to make this right," but concern for their social standing. Because apparently, being exposed as thieves was embarrassing, but actually being thieves was perfectly acceptable. Rebecca sent a novel via text message, a rambling manifesto about family loyalty and forgiveness, and how I was tearing the family apart over money. Over money. As if the money in question wasn't mine to begin with, as if theft was acceptable as long as it stayed within the family. But the most telling response came from Rebecca's husband Tom, who called me directly for the first time in years. "Sarah, I had no idea," he said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "Rebecca never told me about the will, about the inheritance. I thought your parents owned the house outright. If I'd known." If he'd known, maybe things would have been different. Maybe someone would have spoken up for truth and justice. Maybe I wouldn't have spent 2 years paying rent on my own home. But he hadn't known, because the conspiracy of silence had been that complete, that effective. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm taking the kids to my parents' house for a while," he said. "Until this gets sorted out. I won't have them living in a house that's built on lies." And, just like that, the first crack appeared in my family's foundation. Tom was a good man who'd married into crazy, and now that he knew the truth, he was doing what good men do, protecting his children from the toxic behavior of their extended family. The whispers started within days. Our town was small enough that legal documents filed at the courthouse became public knowledge faster than wildfire. The story spread through coffee shops and grocery stores, church potlucks, and school pickup lines. "Did you hear about the Martinez family? The daughter is suing her own parents for stealing her inheritance." But this time, the whispers weren't about my supposed failures or character flaws. This time, people were talking about my parents' behavior, questioning how they could have hidden an inheritance for 2 years, wondering what kind of parents steal from their own children. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd given me such condescending sympathy at the grocery store, stopped by Jessica's apartment to apologize. "I had no idea about the will," she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway with a casserole dish in her hands. "If I'd known what really happened, I never would have. I mean, I hope you can forgive an old woman for believing what she was told." I accepted her apology and her casserole, understanding that she'd been manipulated just like everyone else. My parents had been spinning their version of events since the day they kicked me out, painting themselves as the victims of an ungrateful daughter rather than the perpetrators of theft and fraud. But now the truth was spreading faster than their lies could contain it, and their reputation, the reputation my father had been so worried about, was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. The real vindication came when I drove past the house 3 weeks after delivering the demand letter. There was a "for sale" sign on the front lawn, weathered and slightly crooked, like hope that had been abandoned too quickly. I parked across the street and stared at the place I'd grown up, trying to process the sight of my childhood home being offered to strangers. The shutters needed paint, the garden was overgrown, and several windows were dark in a way that suggested emptiness rather than evening quiet. They were selling. Instead of buying out my share or acknowledging my rightful ownership, they'd chosen to cut their losses and run. It was the financial equivalent of pleading guilty, an admission that they couldn't fight the truth of what they'd done. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "They've agreed to a settlement conference. 50-50 split of sale proceeds, plus compensation for 2 years of illegally collected rent, plus legal fees. You win. I win." The words should have felt triumphant, but mostly they felt hollow. I'd won justice, but I'd lost a family. I'd reclaimed my inheritance, but I'd sacrificed relationships that had shaped my entire life. Victory tasted like ashes and felt like standing alone in an empty room. That night, I sat on Jessica's couch and calculated the numbers. My half of the house sale, plus the compensation for stolen rent, plus the money I'd save by no longer contributing to their mortgage, would be enough for a down payment on my own place. A real place, chosen by me, owned by me, controlled by me. For the first time in my adult life, I would have a home that couldn't be taken away by people who claimed to love me. But the sweetest justice was yet to come. The settlement conference was held in a sterile conference room at Marcus's law firm, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. My parents sat on one side of the long table with their attorney, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling papers and checking his watch. I sat on the other side with Marcus, wearing another sharp blazer and the confidence that comes with being completely, absolutely, legally right. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who'd probably seen every kind of family drama imaginable, but even she seemed slightly taken aback by the facts of our case. "Let me make sure I understand," she said, reading from her notes. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez were the executors of a will that left property to both their daughters in equal shares. They were legally required to inform both daughters of this inheritance when they reached 25. They failed to inform Miss Martinez of her inheritance for 2 years past that deadline, during which time they collected rent from her for living in her own property. Then they attempted to permanently evict her from that property. Is that correct? That's correct, Marcus said simply. The mediator turned to my parents' attorney. Is there any dispute about these facts? The man looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. No, Your Honor. The facts are not in dispute. I'm not a judge, the mediator corrected gently. But I am someone who's seen a lot of family disputes, and this is one of the most clear-cut cases of financial elder abuse I've encountered. Elder abuse? My mother protested. We're not elderly. I meant abuse of Miss Martinez by her elders, the mediator clarified. Adults in positions of authority who took advantage of their child's trust and ignorance for financial gain. The settlement terms were exactly what Marcus had predicted: 50-50 split of the sale proceeds, full compensation for the rent I'd paid on my own home, reimbursement of my legal fees, and a formal apology that would be part of the public record. The apology was the part I'd insisted on, despite Marcus's suggestion that it was unnecessary. I wanted it in writing. I wanted it legally binding. I wanted a document that proved, once and for all, that I hadn't been the problem in this family. My father signed first, his signature shaky and reluctant. My mother signed next, tears streaming down her face. Rebecca wasn't required to sign anything, technically. She'd been as much a victim of our parents' deception as I had been, but she sat in the corner of the room like a statue, saying nothing, doing nothing, choosing silence over solidarity even at the very end. When it was over, when all the papers were signed and the legal machinery was set in motion, the mediator made one final statement. The court recognizes that Miss Martinez was the legal owner of 50% of the property in question, and that her eviction was therefore illegal and invalid. For the record, she had every right to remain in that home, and her removal was accomplished through fraud and deception. She looked directly at me as she spoke these words, and I felt a satisfaction deeper than victory. For 30 days, I'd been the homeless daughter, the family failure, the ungrateful child who couldn't manage her own life. Now, officially and legally, I was the wronged party, the victim of theft, the woman who'd been strong enough to fight for her rights. I gathered my copies of the signed agreements and stood to leave, but my mother's voice stopped me. Sarah, please. Can't we move past this? We're still family. I turned to look at her, this woman who'd given birth to me, but had never really seen me. You said I had 48 hours, I said quietly. Now you have none. Justice feels heavy when you finally hold it in your hands. It tastes like vindication and sounds like legal documents being filed in your favor. But mostly, it feels like the end of something that should have been beautiful but was always rotten at the core. If you're still watching but haven't subscribed, ask yourself, why are you silent when truth is right here? Subscribe or at least explain in the comments why you turn away from justice when it stands in front of you, demanding to be acknowledged. 3 months later, I signed the papers on my own house. Not an apartment, not a condo, but a real house with a front yard and a back porch and a mortgage that belonged entirely to me. It was smaller than the house I'd grown up in, but it was mine in a way that the family home had never been. The moving truck arrived on a Saturday morning, carrying furniture I'd bought with money that was rightfully mine, belongings that had never been contaminated by false generosity or conditional love. I directed the movers with the authority of someone who owned every square inch of the space they were filling. Jessica helped me hang pictures and arrange furniture, marveling at the transformation from homeless couch surfer to homeowner in less than 6 months. "How does it feel?" she asked as we stood in my new living room, surveying our work. "Like breathing after holding your breath for 27 years, I said, and meant every word. The house was quiet in a way that Jessica's apartment never was, not the silence of other people's lives happening around me, but the peace of being exactly where I belonged. No borrowed blankets, no humming refrigerators, no sense of being a temporary inconvenience in someone else's space. That first night in my own bed, in my own room, in my own home, I slept better than I had in months. I woke up to sunlight streaming through windows I had chosen, in a space that answered to no one but me. My phone had stopped buzzing with desperate calls from my family weeks ago. The initial settlement had been followed by the finalization of the house sale, the division of assets, and the closing of a chapter that had been built on lies from the very beginning. Sometimes I drove past their new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a complex across town where they'd been forced to move after selling the house they'd never really owned. Their cars looked smaller in the cramped parking lot, their lives diminished by the natural consequences of their choices. I felt no satisfaction in their reduced circumstances, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices when they decided to steal from me. I'd simply made mine when I decided to stop letting them. The final vindication came 6 months after the settlement, when Rebecca showed up at my front door. She looked tired, older than her 24 years, carrying the weight of a marriage that was struggling and a family legacy that was built on fraud. She stood on my front porch like a supplicant seeking forgiveness, her hands empty, her excuses exhausted. "Can I come in?" she asked. I considered it. Considered the conversations we might have, the apologies she might offer, the reconciliation that might be possible if we both worked hard enough to rebuild what our parents had destroyed. But then I remembered her silence at that final dinner. Her refusal to speak up when I was being illegally evicted from my own home. Her willingness to accept stolen property as long as it benefited her children. "I don't think so," I said, not unkindly but with finality. "Sarah, please. I know I should have said something. I know I should have stood up for you. But I was scared and I didn't know what to do and—" "You knew exactly what to do," I interrupted. "You chose not to do it." She started to cry then, standing on my porch in the evening light, probably hoping that tears would accomplish what words couldn't. But I'd run out of sympathy for people who'd chosen convenience over conscience. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But sorry doesn't give me back 2 years of stolen rent. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation of being kicked out of my own home. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust once it's been shattered by people who were supposed to protect it." I closed the door gently, not in anger but in recognition that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some relationships, once poisoned by betrayal, can never be cleansed. Some families, once revealed to be built on lies, can never return to the innocence they never actually possessed. Through my living room window, I watched her walk back to her car, shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that come when you finally understand the full cost of your choices. Part of me wanted to run after her, to offer comfort and forgiveness and the possibility of starting over. But I'd learned the difference between family and blood relatives. I'd learned that love without respect is just manipulation wearing a prettier mask. I'd learned that forgiveness without accountability is just enabling people to hurt you again. So I let her drive away, and I turned back to my own life, in my own home, surrounded by my own choices and my own consequences. The sun was setting through my kitchen window, casting golden light across the table where I'd been grading papers from my students. My coffee mug sat next to a stack of essays about overcoming challenges, written by teenagers who were just beginning to understand that life rarely goes according to plan. One essay caught my attention, written by a girl named Maria whose family had immigrated from El Salvador when she was 10. She wrote about the courage it takes to leave behind everything familiar and start over in a place where nothing is guaranteed except the opportunity to build something better. Sometimes, she'd written, the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who tell you they love you but treat you like you're worthless. Sometimes family isn't about blood. Sometimes it's about finding people who see your value and help you see it too. I set down her essay and looked around my kitchen, my home, my sanctuary built on truth instead of lies. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. The loneliness wasn't crushing anymore. It was liberating. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Dinner tomorrow? I want to see your new patio furniture. Real friends. Real relationships. Real love that didn't come with conditions or eviction notices, or the constant threat of withdrawal if you failed to be grateful enough for crumbs. I texted back, absolutely. I'll cook. And then I sat in my kitchen, in my house, in my life that was finally, completely, entirely my own, and watched the sunset on a day that belonged to no one but me. They called me a stranger when they kicked me out of my own home. Now I finally was one by choice. Strange to their dysfunction, strange to their lies, strange to their version of love that looked suspiciously like theft. I was a stranger to the family that had raised me, but I was finally familiar to myself. What would you have done in my place? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you can walk away from this story without subscribing, then at least be honest. Why turn from truth when it stands right in front of you? This is the story of what happens when victims become victors, when silence becomes a weapon, and when home is finally, truly, what you make it. Some endings taste like justice. Some taste like freedom. This one tasted like both, seasoned with the salt of tears that were no longer mine to cry for people who'd forfeited the right to my sorrow when they chose greed over love. The house was quiet, but it was my quiet now. And that made all the difference.